go in and we're like, all right, we'll build this awesome airport and you have to let us use it for 10 years. And then we'll just give it to you.
And then you're, yeah.
And then, by the way, UPS is going to want to come into your country, you know?
Yeah.
It's super interesting. Stuff we don't think of, you know?
Right. Changing channels. Did I talk about this second bit of the table?
Not the second
I didn't
bit.
think so. Okay. It all just merges and blends together. Okay. That. And I am pretty sure I have not posted any of these recordings. I will get them posted. Probably doesn't matter for the people that are tuning in real time, right? And the other people are like, what happened? If they ever look at it in the first place. Okay. I left you guys off halfway through talking about a handful of bacterial culprits. And then we're going to shift gears and think about some other stuff. All right. As I said, there are massive amounts of organisms when we start thinking about GI issues. All right. So I know a few of these in here we have seen in the PowerPoints. So we talked about Helicobacter pylori and the peptic ulcers, all sorts of potentials with this and some of the signs and symptoms with that. Oftentimes, you know, I feel like people blame their ulcers on spicy foods or, you know, all sorts of things. Not that spicy foods can't add some pain to that, but truly not the culprit, right? Salmonellosis, we showed an image, an electron micrograph of our little salmonella bacteria. There's a handful, Enteritica and some serotypes. There's a handful of different ones that would stimulate an immune response. When we talk about a serotype, we talk about the ability to differentiate based off of antibody production. So a handful of different kind of subgroups or subtypes, but in this case, we define them as serotypes that stimulate subtly different antibody responses. All right. So there are oftentimes some serious issues and complications potential if you're little and contract salmonella. Shigella, there's a long list kind of Shigella culprits. Dysenteriae, as we see here with the dysentery. Flexneri, Boydii, and Sunny are all potentials that can cause some GI discomfort for sure, all right? So all sorts of possibilities with this. And like our E. coli, the bad guy, well, one of the bad guys, because there were a handful of them, it also, this one has a potential for hemolytic uremic syndrome. Little side note with that, the 0157H7, as it's causing bloody diarrhea, it's the result of Shiga toxin, which is a shared friend from Shigella. Part of me says, oh, that was the result of plasmid, but I don't think that is true. I believe it was a bacteriophage that transferred this gene to E. coli, if I recall properly. There are multiple ways bacteria can exchange stuff. It doesn't just have to be conjugation. Transduction is another potential. And I'm pretty sure that's how E. coli picked that up from its cousin, if you will, Shigella. All right. Crappy. All right. Staphylococcal food poisoning. As I mentioned with this before, typically we're thinking about the toxins being secreted by the staph bacterium, not the actual organisms causing issues. So a poisoning, right? An intoxication, not an actual infection, all right? This is something that's pretty quick to show up within maybe handfuls of hours after ingestion of this toxin. Pretty rapid onset with nausea and diarrhea, vomiting, lasting a day or two. There's potential for dehydration. again, kind of depends on how severe the situation truly is. So we think about a couple of potentials with it: ingestion of raw or undercooked meat or dairy products that are contaminated with those toxins, the enterotoxins from Staphylococcus. There are some other gram positives that we think about with some of these things as well. And there are other things, exotoxins, things that are being secreted. I think of exotoxins with the positives, and the endotoxins are things with gram negatives. That lipopolysaccharide layer, the lipid A that's in the outer membrane, as I mentioned with the E. coli, there's handfuls of those strains that we would think about treating with antibiotics because of compounding the endotoxin release, right? Typhoid fever is back up to the top with some salmonella, but it's a little bit different as we see some subtypes, typhi and paratyphi. Enterica, as we see up above, is another potential for this as well. So typhoid fever is different than salmonellosis. There are some similarities, but a little bit different. Aches and headaches, nausea, lethargy, constipation. There's other possibilities with this bacterium where it could perforate the bowel, lending to some potential fatal consequences with that, right? So this fecal oral route, and it may also potentially be spread by asymptomatic carriers. I'm sure you have all heard of typhoid Mary, right? All sorts of details about that. And I've learned some stuff, and then, thanks to YouTube, I have seen a handful of other things about that I was like, wow, very interesting, right? So she was a carrier, didn't recognize really any ill effects. It's not like she's crapping herself to death and then making sandwiches for everybody, all right? She doesn't recognize she's got issues, doesn't think there's issues in the first place. And she also has some pretty stinking poor hygiene, all right? Washing your hands, forget about it. I did that last week, right? There's definitely some issues with that, all right? And the fecal oral transmission, you use your imagination, all right? I wouldn't want a sandwich made by Typhoid Mary, all right? At the time, she didn't go by Typhoid Mary, right? I don't think she ever called herself that, but she should have, right? Kind of crazy. And then Yersinia, not Yersinia pestis. We're not talking bubonic plague, folks. A couple of other cousins, Yersinia enterocolitica and pseudotuberculosis, both of which have the potential for some GI issues, kind of a little, more mild. Not that I technically want any of these, all right? But there are some potentials that it can cause other issues, bacteremia, if it makes its way into circulation, lending to some bigger issues, all right? Okay, let me stop that share. Okay, PowerPoint icon. Now I'm back in business. Okay. So shifting over to some viral culprits, and there are a few that can cause pretty nasty GI issues. Rotavirus, because it is a kind of wheel shape, right, is one that is a pretty common viral culprit for some GI discomfort. It's maybe a better one for little kids, but it can target all sorts. I recall as an undergraduate in a virology class, so just focusing on the huge diversity of viruses that cause all sorts of crazy stuff, not just people, but other things as well. Needing to understand and learn about all of these things, and we move into some of the body site stuff, and we're talking about GI issues, and there's a plethora of virus that can do this. And rotavirus, I remembered because every time I thought about rotavirus, I thought roto-rooter, right? That's a crappy job, right? And it all fits, although this roto-rooter has nothing to do with rotavirus, all right? But I feel like it should be, right? So that's how I remember rotaviruses are GI issues, all right? So there are others that we think about, and we, pictures where we've only really got our rotavirus, but norovirus and astrovirus. Norovirus, I feel like is almost guaranteed if you decide you want to take a cruise, you almost ought to assume you're going to contract this. It is something that is super common, especially in situations like that, all right? There are other possibilities, but definitely it's one. It is very contagious. We think about direct contact or contact with contaminated food or fomites, so inanimate objects. Somebody, again, kind of poor hygiene, doesn't wash their hands properly, touches a doorknob, you in turn touch that, or something else, and then you get infected that way. So super easy for those situations. And if you are on a cruise ship, you are all in close quarters, basically confined, although you're probably going to get off and check out different areas. When you get back to the ship, you're all there. So the potential is pretty good. All right. There are other instances, salad bars and things like that, where norovirus may potentially lend itself to others. All right. So kind of like this one, projectile vomiting, that's hardcore. All right. It's more than just vomiting, right? This is serious. If you are projectile vomiting, there's something up, right? Kind of exorcism-like, right? That's what I think of. So typically, generally self-limiting, couple of days, you feel bad, maybe like you've been possessed, and then you feel better, all right? So we're going in reverse order. Astrovirus, all of these gastroenteritis, the symptoms kind of similar, fever and headache. Oftentimes we see, fever as a result with viral culprits as well. Doesn't matter really where they're at. Headache, discomfort, diarrhea, and vomiting, but not projectile, all right? So all of these fecal oral contamination situations, all sorts of things setting the stage. And as I said with the rotavirus, little kids and elderly are more susceptible for contracting some of this. And it's just really the result of immune response. And adults typically may come in contact with some of this and don't really, see any big issues or discomfort, right? So shifting over to a handful of other virus, hepatitis has a plethora of different types of viruses, and potentially there are some others out there that are yet to truly be identified. So there's 5 main types that we think about as causing hepatitis. There are some other potentials where we can see hepatitis that's non-viral, all right? Hepatitis is where the liver is impacted, and we will see a couple of different potentials with this, where we can see maybe signs and symptoms with jaundice, yellowing of the skin, or the sclera, the eyes, the whites of the eyes. All of this can be indicative of that, and it kind of depends on your circumstances. We'll hit this here in just a second. As far as how you might be contracting this stuff, it could be fecal oral transmission, it could be blood transmission, kind of just depends, and we will move through here. And as we get to the tail end, these guys potentially can be working together. We'll hit that as well. So there's a few details with this. The hepatitis A is non-enveloped, single-stranded RNA, member of the picornavirus, and then we've grouped them. This would handful of different groupings here, Baltimore group, and I believe this is an antibody that allows us to, or antigens that allow us to detect via antibody detection. Hepatitis B is a double-stranded DNA, so you can see they're not all the same. right? And as I described earlier on, thinking about diversity of virus, they've got genetic material that's one or the other. It's DNA or it's RNA. It could be single or double stranded in either instance with the respective nucleotides. This replicates with reverse transcriptase and a member of the hepadnavirus, so different families, different family trees, if you will, Baltimore group 7 with that. C is an enveloped single-stranded positive sense as well, same as the A, and filovirus family, another Baltimore 4 like this one, but different family, the coronavirus versus filovirus. D is enveloped single-stranded circular and group 5. This one propagating only in the presence of hepatitis B, right? So D and B go together. I said E and D, but no, B and D. So D only rears itself up if you are co-infected and have hepatitis B. If you have hepatitis D and no B, you don't really recognize any issues with this at all. It's not unless this one's in there, all right? And then E is another non-enveloped single-stranded Hepabirdae family. So a handful of different potentials. All of them impact the liver, hence the hepatitis category. So inflammation of the liver, and as I said, it doesn't have to just be viral causes. There can be chemically induced things where your liver, is full of toxins that ultimately lend to issues as well. There are numerous things that can result with this, all right? So we can see inflammation and potentially damage to that liver as well. The jaundice, as we're looking at this, kind of the yellowing of the skin, and you can see the whites of the eyes also, the sclera. Like I said, you potentially can see that. That may be your first hint that something like that is happening, all right? There are also potentials when we think about this, that if it's someone that you live with from day to day, you may not even really recognize these issues, right? And it's not until, somebody else looks and they're like, man, you sure look kind of yellow, right? Are you feeling okay, right? Something like that maybe raises that flag that there's something else going on, right? Really kind of depends. All right, let me shift gears back to sharing this guy. And come on. Okay. So with this, we've got him, and I'll scroll here in a second. The hepatitis A typically can be asymptomatic. You don't recognize any issues. Maybe mild or self-limiting, couple of weeks to a couple months, maybe. Depends on the situation with this, all right? There are bigger problems where it can, in a rare situation, lend to fatal fulminant hepatitis, but typically it's not something that results in that. It's rather self-limiting. We think about contaminated, fecal oral transmission, contaminated food or water, person-to-person transmission. Oftentimes you hear about issues with hepatitis A outbreaks from restaurant situations. Somebody that works in this restaurant contracts it, and in turn, they start spreading the news. If you happened to eat at this establishment, you might want to go get checked, right? You don't know, all right? So kind of just depends, and relatively common. I know I have heard a couple of restaurants, this was years back, in Pocatello and Idaho Falls that had issues with some hepatitis. And I think, every year you really hear about this stuff. So there are vaccines recommended, and we have that in the childhood vaccine schedule. Hepatitis B, similar to A, but it can progress to cause some serious liver damage, cirrhosis, liver failure, and lend to liver cancer. This is not fecal oral transmission. It's a body fluid, blood typical, but semen and saliva can also transmit this. IV drug use, sexual transmission, all sorts of possibilities with that lending to hepatitis B. C fits as a similar type of transmission with that. All right. So a couple of issues. There are, as far as some of the antimicrobials, interferon, and a few antivirals with that, there are vaccines in there as well for hepatitis B. Hepatitis C, often asymptomatic. There are a good chunk of these individuals that are chronic carriers. It has, like B, the opportunity to progress to cirrhosis and liver failure, and liver cancer is another potential with that. Similar modes of transmission as hepatitis B. And then with this, it depends on some of the treatment, depends on the specific genotype of that virus as far as how or whether or not cirrhosis is going to present. There are definitely some potentials to deal with this and cure individuals with hepatitis C. The kicker is a good number of them don't recognize they've got issues in the first place. It's not until it's progressed to maybe these issues. And then the question is it, too late? Possibly. Hepatitis D, similar to B, self-limiting within a couple of weeks, but it can become chronic. And as we said, it's activated with B. So blood transfusion situation is another opportunity for that. And only if you're co-infected, all right? So vaccine against hepatitis B protects against hepatitis D because you can't get B if you've been vaccinated, right? And then E, asymptomatic to self-limiting, typically not something that we think of as a chronic situation. It is like type A with the fecal oral route. And so the potential for opportunities like type A or hepatitis A, similar, right? And some supportive treatments, things like that. There is a vaccine, it says here, only available in China. As of yet, all right. Back this. Okay, so shifting over a bit from the virus, now we want to think about some other potentials, really parasites, right? Not that any of these other things wouldn't technically be classified as a parasite, right? A parasite's something that's robbing you of nutrients, bacterial disease-causing organisms. We call them pathogens, but deep down, we could think of them as parasites. In parasitology, we typically think about protozoal organisms and the helminths, the worms, as the parasites, right? So I just want to give the quick disclaimer, all of these other suckers are parasites too, deep down, all right? But now I want to talk about parasites, all right? And I brought you some to show, all right? So none of the protists, I don't have any of those, but I do have a rack of worms, all right? And another one. I'll show you that one in a second, all right? So this Cryptosporidium, as we're looking at this is an immunofluorescent, so we've got some fluorescent green dye that is on here that allows us to see the Cryptosporidia within there. And these are pretty good culprits for some diarrhea. It's definitely something, it's a water situation is a good one for this, and swimming pools potentially lending to issues with cryptosporidium. Kind of crazy. Cyclospora cataensis. This is a parasite that's pretty new on the radar, all right? I wouldn't say it's new to be infecting people, but as far as us recognizing it as a pathogen, pretty new, all right? I want to say the 90s, all right, was when it was first kind of recognized as an issue. Not 100% sure if it was 90s or not, but I think right around that, all right? So this another image, this is autofluorescent under UV light. So it's not stained with the fluorescent dye like the cryptosporidium that we just looked at, but it is fluorescent, all right? Kind of cool, all right? And I've got a little story I will tell you with that guy here in a second. Is that all I got for those poor little things? I thought for sure I had I think at the end, I know there's a picture of Giardia, but I think it's the end exercise thing. All right, hang on. Let me stop sharing this because you need this table. All right, open stacks, come back to me. So yeah, the giardiasis, as I'm scrolling through there, Giardia it's one of my favorites. Amoebiasis, we'll talk about it as well as we get to this table. So these, kind of a short list of the protists that can infect us. There's maybe a little bit more we could slop on here, but this is okay. So amoebiasis or amoebic dysentery. Entamoeba histolytica is an amoeba that can cause some pretty serious GI issues. It's something that you may contract from traveling abroad. There's definitely some potentials with that, and there are opportunities to get it in the US as well, but it's not as much, right? So kind of depends, right, on the circumstances, depends on how it's progressing. Sometimes I think about some of these as a dosage dependent situation. How many of these did you ingest in the first place to get them situated? If it's not too many, maybe it's more mild. And if you had mouthfuls of the stuff, maybe that lends to some more serious situations, all right? The amoeba, as it gets in and starts growing and replicating by binary fission, similar way that bacteria replicate and can increase their populations really pretty well. So can be mild diarrhea to some severe dysentery and colitis. There are potentials as this amoeba gets in and starts causing infection. It starts, in the intestinal mucosa, it starts to erode that. You can look at some images of that, like colonoscopy, and see some of these lesions. It actually, if you were to look at them in, blow it up in greater detail, kind of a flask-shaped lesion as it goes in and expands. As they are doing that and forming this, it potentially ulcerates and can perforate the intestine, allowing the amoeba out of the intestine, and now you've got extra intestinal amoebiasis. The first spot these suckers hit is the liver, all right? And all of the sudden, not that the intestines weren't a nice place to be living, but the liver, they're like, holy cow, this is awesome. And they go to town. They cause some serious damage to the liver. Jaundice could be an example of that in these individuals, but it's not hepatitis virus, right? It's amoeba, all right? Different situation. There are opportunities for the amoeba to feed in the liver and in turn to move up. They can perforate the diaphragm and move into the lungs. And if that happens, you pretty much are going to die. All right. If they impact the liver, prognosis is pretty poor. All right. Oftentimes individuals get, big chunks of their liver cut away. Your liver can regenerate. You can remove a good chunk of it and it can grow back. All right. But it truly depends on these circumstances. All right. So these amoeba, the trophozoite, the amoeboid form is what hatches out from these cysts after we've ingested them. So it's a fecal oral transmission. We think about contaminated water, food, or off of your hands, lending to infection with this. And there's a handful of different treatments for that. The cryptosporidium, we saw an image of that guy. Watery diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, cramps, dehydration, and weight loss. Another fecal oral situation, infected mice, birds, and farm animals are potentials for contracting cryptosporidium. Food, water, and swimming pools. All right. They are definitely potentials for that. All right. So little kids, potentially, they should have a swim diaper on as they go to the pool, but sometimes that doesn't happen, or sometimes it leaks, right? And now all of a sudden there's issues. Swimming pools are a good one. And it doesn't have to just be that, right? There are showers that they hope you shower before you get into the pool, and issues with that. If you don't, potentially you're bringing some of that in there. And they also recommend, if you have had diarrhea in the past handful of days, you shouldn't go swimming, right? Because potentially you got this stuff and now you're going to take a dip into the pool and share it with everyone. Bad news, all right? Kind of just think of, maybe you ought to stay away from that public swimming pool or cesspool. I don't think you want that, right? Even if it smells like it's super chlorinated, right? I've got another story about that, but I'm not going to talk about it. It's better to just leave that alone. Cyclospora cadiensis. This one can be some explosive diarrhea. It reminds me of the projectile vomiting, right? It's projectile diarrhea, all right? Impressive, all right? Fever, nausea, vomiting, cramps, weight loss, not a good diet plan, all right? Ingestion of contaminated food or water is a potential for cyclospora. The cyclospora with some of the contaminated food, there was an outbreak. This is the story I was going to tell you. There was an outbreak. There were a bunch of doctors, a bunch of anesthesiologists. This is coming from a Monsters Inside Me episode that followed kind of the progression of this. And this is when it was really first identified, right, as a potential culprit, right? And that, like I said, I think the 90s. So these doctors had all gone from multiple counties in California, had all gone to this banquet that was put on by a pharmaceutical industry. Oftentimes they do that. They wine and dine and try to woo you and use these drugs, right? This is what we want you to do. So they were trying to get all of these anesthesiologists together and have this big meeting and talk about stuff. They fed them nice food, and then a day or two later, a bunch of people start calling in sick. They're crapping themselves to death. They don't know what's going on. The one doctor's talking about stuff, and he's like, yeah, so I go to the medicine cabinet, pop a couple Cipro. And I'm like, okay, interesting. Doctors maybe have antibiotics in the medicine cabinet at the ready. Part of me is like, that's not good, right? We'll leave that there, all right? So he starts trying to, it's not effective, he's not doing, and he just continues to progress. And as it goes on, all of a sudden there's, a handful, then a dozen, now 20, now 30 or 40 different doctors and spouses super sick, all right, massive diarrhea. They can't hardly even make it out of bed. And if they do, it's only to go to the bathroom, right? They don't know what's going on, all right? So there's a lab technician. She's trying to figure out all of these things. There's not a diagnostic test for this. But in the back of her mind, she recalls an article that talks about cyclospora, and she starts thinking maybe this is the culprit, and she designs a test to identify this and finds it. And I'm like, that's stinking brilliant. The medical lab scientists are the behind the scenes heroes, all right? They do all sorts of stuff. And then the doctor comes in and says, this is what you've got. How does he know that or she know that? Because the med techs told them, right? They're the ones that showed them, right? So shout out to the med techs. She identifies this stuff, shows them, and here's these, you know, just as we saw, scroll up right here, right? So come to find out, these guys got infected from the ingestion of raspberries, right? And raspberries, oftentimes you go to the supermarket, you see these raspberries in their little containers. They've been picked, put in the container, and shipped to the store. You buy them, you open them, and you eat them. They've never been washed, right? That's an issue, right? And in turn, lending to some of these potentials. The cyclospora can contaminate all sorts of things, but produce, vegetables, things like that, that maybe don't get washed are an issue, all right? There's, you know, other things, basil and other stuff, some herbs, they could have it on them as well, all right? Chop that up and make yourself some pesto, right? Think about that, all right? Issues, all right? I think raspberries maybe get rinsed now, but if you have ever picked raspberries and then washed them, you see very quickly they start to kind of break down a little bit, right? Not so good, right? That's why they just pick them and pack them and ship them off, right? So all of these people, you know, it was all epidemiology where they're trying to figure out what's going on, trying to trace stuff. What did you eat? What didn't you eat? Trying to figure out some commonalities. And the most common thing was a dessert with fresh raspberries as part of it. They all had that. Everybody that had this diarrhea going on, had this severe issues, all of them had that same dessert. And so then they go back and sure enough, all right, impressive, right? And a little disturbing, all right? Giardiasis, Giardia lamblia, and it's got a couple of other names. Microbiology books always call it lamblia. Parasitology has transitioned. Giardia duodenalis is because the duodenum is where they really say that's where we want to be. That's what we call it. It also goes by intestinalis. So you can see lamblia, intestinalis, and duodenalis. They're all the same thing. It's not three different species. It's all Giardia, all right? So this one, diarrhea, nausea, stomach cramps, gas, greasy stools. Your lipid digestion is pretty much not happening. And so you defecate all of that out. Very greasy stools floating. That's maybe a little too descriptive. Dehydration can be very severe. And it may also lend to some malabsorption syndrome. There are potentials for these Giardia to basically take up every single cell within the intestine, within the duodenum. Within the intestine, they can take it all up, right? And so now the potential for trying to get nutrients is minimized for sure. We ingest the cysts. The cysts are passed in the feces. The cysts hatch into Giardia as a flagellate. This little flagellated trophozoite starts replicating and causing issues. It is contracted through contaminated water often. So some sort of thing like that, fomites that have come in contact with it that have the cysts on there are potentials. It's a good one for camping situations where you potentially drink some water that you shouldn't be, stream water or something like that, or you may see this spring that looks like the water's just bubbling right up out of the mountain. Maybe it's not up above, right? And it was contaminated and you've ingested those cysts. This typically takes about a month after ingestion before you feel the ill effects, because those handful of cysts need to hatch out, propagate, and then you start feeling the ill effects once they've taken up all of this residence, all right? Bad news. Yes?
Does the, what do they call it, life straw?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
Would that catch?
Yep.
Like the
Yep.
cysts and stuff?
Yep. So that will prevent, it filters. So these cysts are bigger than bacteria, and it's going to filter out bacteria as well. So life
You're
straw.
okay.
Yep, you're okay. So you could drink right out of the stream if you had something like that. You can filter your water. You can boil your water. I mean, potentially chlorinating it, but you're better off. I would not count on chlorination as being the effective mechanism, right? I boil it, right? And if you're going camping, you're not going to be chlorinating your stream water, right? That's not happening, all right? So those are the ideas, and I will leave them at that. We will see a picture of Giardia at the end of this. Back to this, we're booking right along. We've got a few minutes left. Now for my worms. I love them. All right. And I do think there's not too many images left in here. Is that right? 10? We'll see. Not quite 10. So Ascaris lumbricoides, these are roundworms or nematodes. I brought one to share. First off, this is the biggest test tube you've probably ever seen. That's impressive, all right? Don't take my cork out. So this is a roundworm. This is Ascaris lumbricoides, pretty good size. You want to pass it around? You want to just see it from here? You're like, I'm good, I don't want to see it. Impressive. And here you can see, a buttload of worms in these circumstances. This other little guy is full of some roundworms and some tapeworms, flatworms, right? And a little fluke. I think that's coming out of a sheep. If you're interested, you can take a peek at these as well. But I gather you probably don't want to see them. That's okay. I look at him every day. I don't, not really. Like, man, he's a weirdo, right? So there are potentials, as we see here with this section of intestine. There are potentials for some severe, serious, possible fatal intestinal blockages. Depends on the circumstances. Here we can see a mass of worms that were excreted by a kid. There are all sorts of antihelminthic drugs. A lot of these drugs, there's a couple of different modes of action. Some of them starve the worm and then it dies and is defecated out. Others will paralyze the worm. Ultimately, they all kind of starve them. So it's paralyzed, now it can't actively feed, then it dies in one way or another. We're going to get them out of there. And so treatment with that, there are sometimes I get individuals in here that have served missions abroad. If you've served a mission in the United States, highly unlikely they're treating you with antiparasitic drugs. But if you travel outside of the US, you probably are treated with some antiparasitic drugs. Potentially every handful of months, you'd get some treatment, all right? Kind of just depending. And they call it the balm, all right? That's not the trade name of this drug, all right? But as you take that the next morning, if you truly have some parasites, the balm will let you know, and you're going to present with a toilet bowl full of some nastiness, right? Impressive and disturbing at the same time, all right? Here's an egg. This is how we would become infected, all right? So kind of impressive. Hookworms. Oh man, there's so many things I want to talk about. So little time. Hookworms, there's a couple of different types of hookworms. This one, Ankylostoma canum, is a hookworm that, and we can see a couple of issues. This is not the right one, all right, to plague us, all right? Ankylostoma duodenalis is a human hookworm, all right? Necator americanus is another human hookworm. The others plague other things and potentially get into us, but can't complete their migration, all right? So one way or another, our skin or tissues don't allow for this parasite to truly migrate like it should, all right? All of these hookworms get transmitted to us by the larval stage, not the egg. Here's the egg. The egg gets defecated out by an animal, potentially us, if it's the right type of parasite, or a dog or something else. Canum is in dogs, all right? So it gets defecated out, the parasite hatches, it starts feeding on bacteria. The larval form gets inoculated into us when we step on it, all right? Barefooted, all right? So wear your shoes outside. We don't see big issues, and we definitely don't see the human pathogens of this, but there are maybe some of the animal ones that you could get if you happen to step on it outside. The larval form penetrates through the skin, and then in the case of this, can't migrate like it should, so it stays localized in the skin, moving around, and you see some localized inflammatory response. Topical ointment kills the parasite, your body ultimately destroys it from within, all right? Kind of crazy, all right? The others that do get into you, they penetrate into the skin. The larval form gets in there. They make their way into the circulation, to the lungs. They break out into the airways. You hack them up and swallow them down. And then they're in the intestines where they want to be. Then they start growing as the adult form, releasing eggs, and the cycle is complete. Ankylostoma duodenalis that infects people, we can get infected by the egg or the larval stage. So there are contamination issues that lend to it. Necator americanus only infects in the larval stage. Way too much information for you, but I think it's pretty stinking awesome, all right? One last little tidbit with this. There is a gentleman in England that is a, I don't know what he calls himself, but he will sell you his hookworms. If you've got ailments that you think could potentially be treated with this, he will sell them to you. He had some issues. This is another monsters. He had some issues, allergies and things like that, and he went abroad and infected himself with numerous types of worms. The hookworms are what we're really focusing on. There are ideas with, you know, the hygiene hypothesis that we're in a pretty sterile environment and we see allergies and autoimmune diseases that other countries don't think about because they're plagued with parasites, right? Maybe getting yourself a couple parasites helps alleviate some of these issues, all right? So all of his issues went away, right? Is it a cure? Probably not, all right? But the symptoms are the issue. And if you can eliminate the symptoms, the problem's pretty much not on the radar anymore, all right? So they think about some opportunities, possible autoimmune issues, maybe inoculating yourself with some worms can be beneficial, all right? A sidebar with this, these worms that truly infect us, a handful of them, a dozen, less than 25, truly, you don't really recognize any issues at all, right? It's when you've got numbers above that that there's potential problems. So if you can, with a handful, right, and not hundreds, you could alleviate symptoms and not have any ill effects from the worms themselves, all right? Kind of cool, kind of disturbing, all right? My gut tells me most people would say, hell no, I am not infecting myself with worms, all right? There are other ideas because some of these parasites, some of these worms secrete things to the outside, excretory, secretory products Some of these things we think are what stimulates our immune response. And so instead of ingesting a worm, you could ingest some of this substance, this protein that's being secreted. Now it's just a little pill, not a worm. Many people probably would do that, all right? But we're not at that point yet, all right? We haven't figured that out. Okay, I'm gonna quit with that. I'm gonna leave you with pinworms. We'll pick up the last little bit of this Monday and then move into our next stuff. Questions or concerns? I'll tell you, pinworms, fun for the whole family.